I was born on a tiny island in the Caribbean, a place called St. Anne. My father served there as governor. Everyone knew him as a stern, disciplined man. I only wish he had ever been a gentle father to me. When my mother was still alive, she was the bridge between us. She could soften him, persuade him to spend at least a little time with me. He would take me into his office, sit me on a tall chair, and tell me about our island, how it was governed, how many people served under him, what kind of ships our port welcomed. I was far too young to understand any of it, but it didn't matter. What mattered was simply being near that powerful, distant man. 7 years ago, my mother passed away, and suddenly it was just the two of us. Devastated by grief, my father buried himself even deeper in his duties. I was left in the care of a governess who never cared much for me either. After that, books became my only refuge. In the dusty old library of our house, I discovered an entire collection of pirate tales and stories of faraway journeys. I spent my days curled up in a large armchair by the window, reading about daring captains, hidden treasure, and sword fights under the blazing sun. In those pages, pirates were noble rogues, defying fate with reckless courage. Their lives seemed full of freedom and fire, so different, so impossibly distant from my quiet, orderly world. And so, the days drifted by, months, years, until everything changed on the day I turned 17.
The morning began with a miracle. Mrs. Ann, our housekeeper, walked into my room carrying a large cardboard box. Her usually severe face was lit with an uncharacteristic smile. "Look, child," she said. "It came from London. A special order from your father." Inside the box was a dress, not the usual pale blue or dull gray I was accustomed to, but the warm color of ripe peaches. The silk spilled through my fingers like water, and the delicate lace on the sleeves and bodice looked as if it had been woven from morning mist. I had never worn anything like it. When Mrs. Ann fastened the last button on the back and I turned toward the mirror, I froze. Reflected there stood not a girl, but a young lady. The dress somehow made my red hair even more radiant, like the glow of a sunset. My dark green eyes looked deeper, more vivid against the peach-colored silk. My waist seemed slimmer, my shoulders more graceful. For a moment, I felt as if this was the day everything would change, the day my father might finally see me not as a child, but as his grown daughter. Perhaps he might even smile. I caught myself believing that something important would happen today, something magical. Before dinner, my father unexpectedly came into my room. He looked unusually animated. He gave me a rare, approving glance, one I could count on my fingers. Then he said, "Gloria, tonight we'll be joined by a special guest, Lord Edmund Hargrave. He arrived from London just yesterday." From England? My heart skipped a beat. What was he like, this lord? Could he be as young and charming as the heroes in my books? What would this meeting bring me? Unexpected happiness or terrible disappointment?
That evening, when I came down to the dining room in my new peach-colored dress, he was already seated beside my father. He was heavy-set, with shiny, oily skin and a polished bald head ringed by thin, wispy gray hair. His plump fingers clutched a wine glass, leaving greasy smudges on the crystal. My father, unusually animated, introduced me. "My daughter, Gloria." The Lord heaved himself to his feet. His small, swollen eyes crawled over me,
from my red hair down to the tips of my shoes. Something flickered in them. Not warmth, not admiration, but a greedy, possessive spark, the look of a collector who has just discovered a rare specimen. As he took my hand for a formal kiss, he hissed, "Charming." His lips, damp and soft, barely brushed my skin, yet the touch sent a shiver of revulsion through me. It felt unpleasant, sticky, as though he'd left a trace behind. His fingers held my hand a moment longer and tighter than propriety allowed. The entire evening after dinner, he did not leave my side. He asked questions about my interests, my books, but listened only half-heartedly. His gaze, heavy and intrusive, drifted over my face, my neck, my bare shoulders. I felt like a butterfly pinned to velvet, beautiful but completely helpless. I tried to catch my father's eye, to look for some sign of protection or concern, but he only nodded approvingly as he sipped his wine. He was pleased that his distinguished guest was paying such kind attention to his daughter. The peach-colored silk that had felt like the dress of a princess that morning suddenly became tight, suffocating. The magic of my day dissolved like sea mist, leaving behind only a heavy, unpleasant aftertaste and the oily stare of Lord Hargrave. That night, I couldn't sleep. Lord Hargrave's raspy voice still echoed in my ears, and my skin seemed to remember the touch of his hand. I needed air, just one breath of cool night wind. I slipped on a light silk robe and tiptoed out into the dark garden. The moon lit the pathways, and I hoped that the quiet and the coolness would calm my nerves. I was wrong. I had barely taken a few steps from the house when a large shadow detached itself from behind a tall magnolia. Lord Hargrave. He stood there, blocking the path back, his glossy face twisted into a smug, unsettling smile that gleamed in the moonlight. Can't the young rose fall asleep? He stepped closer. The scent of expensive wine and sweat hit me. I instinctively moved back, but he was faster. His thick fingers clamped around my wrist with surprising strength. "Don't be afraid, my beauty. Why waste your life on this forgotten corner of the world? I could take you to London, shower you with gold and diamonds, dress you in the finest gowns, fitting for such a rare pearl." "Let me go," I managed to say, though my voice trembled, barely louder than a whisper. He reached for me with his other hand. I felt his damp fingers, like slick tentacles, dig into my side, pulling me toward him, pressing me against his soft, repulsive body. His breath, heavy and uneven, burned against my cheek. "Come now, don't behave like a child. I'll show you the real world." I froze, paralyzed by fear and disgust. His hands felt like sticky webs, wrapping around me, stealing my strength, my voice, my breath. They moved across my back, bold and invasive, and I knew he wasn't joking. He would not stop. And in that moment, something snapped inside me. Fear was swallowed by a fierce physical revulsion. I jerked back with all the strength I had. The silk of my robe tore in his hand with an awful rip, but his grip loosened. "I'll tell my father. He'll deal with you. You'll answer for this." I didn't wait for his reply. I ran and ran as fast as I could, without looking back. I flew through the dark corridors of the house until I burst into my room and locked the door behind me. Only then did I allow myself to shake, leaning against the wood. I didn't close my eyes for the rest of the night. I sat on my bed, clutching the blanket, listening to every sound. Every creaking floorboard made me flinch. I was terrified,
not just of the Lord, but of the realization that in my own home, I had no one to rely on. Father? He saw only a valuable guest, nothing more. My peach-colored dress, the symbol of my morning's hopes, lay crumpled on the chair. It no longer felt beautiful. It felt like a uniform for a victim. And I vowed to myself that I would never wear it again. Morning found me exactly as I had been all night, sitting upright on my bed, a blanket wrapped tightly around my shoulders. I hadn't slept for a single moment. Fear rang in my ears like a constant high-pitched note, and every muscle in my body ached from tension. With the first rays of sunlight, there was a knock at the door, sharp and commanding. I jolted, my heart dropping to my stomach. It was our housekeeper's voice. "Ms. Gloria, His Excellency requires you in his office, immediately." Requires. The word hung in the air like a heavy bell tolling. I rose slowly. My legs felt weak, unsteady. I didn't even bother changing. I threw a shawl over my torn silk robe and stepped out. My father stood in the center of his office, his back to the window. He didn't turn when I entered. The air in the room was cold and heavy, like the sky before a storm. "Gloria." He said my name like a sentence being passed. At last he turned. His face was pale, with restrained fury, and his eyes burned with ice. "This morning, Lord Hargrave came to see me." My breath caught. I opened my mouth to speak, but he lifted his hand sharply, silencing me instantly. He informed me of some rather delicate matters concerning your late-night visit to the garden, your behavior. As a gentleman, he is willing to correct your impulsive actions and restore your honor. He intends to make you his wife. The world tilted. "Father, no!" The words tore out of me, my voice breaking. "He's lying. He attacked me. I tried to get away. He tore my robe. I held out the ripped silk, desperate for him to understand. But his expression only hardened. Enough. I will not listen to your childish fantasies. Lord Hargrave is a respectable man. And you've clearly inherited not only your mother's looks, but her frivolous nature." The breath was knocked from me. I couldn't scream anymore. I couldn't cry. Only a cold, hollow emptiness spread through my chest. "You will leave with him for England, as his lawful wife. It is the only way to silence this scandal. Pack your things. The ship sails tomorrow with the evening tide." He turned back to the window. Conversation over. To him, his daughter was nothing more than a problem to be resolved, an inconvenience to be disposed of. I don't remember how I walked out of his office. My ears roared with a deafening buzz, and my body still remembered Lord Hargrave's repulsive touch, as if it had been burned into my skin. My own father had chosen to believe a deceitful stranger over me. He had traded me away like a piece of unwanted property, just to please an influential guest. Something inside me broke then, and died. The house I once thought of as a sanctuary became a trap. My father, its warden, and the future they had chosen for me felt like the cruelest sentence of all. That day felt endless. I sat in my room like someone waiting for a sentence to be carried out, listening to the house fill with restless noise, trunks being packed, preparations for my fortunate departure. Every sound was like a hammer driving another nail into the lid of my coffin. But when night finally fell, something stirred inside the numbness that had paralyzed me all day. A spark of desperate, wild determination. Better to die at sea Better to become food for the fish than to live as that man's possession. I would not let them turn me into an object. When the house grew silent, I began to move. I worked quickly, quietly, guided by instinct. I took no dresses, no trinkets, only food I could slip from the kitchen without being noticed. Dry bread, a piece of cheese, a few apples. I wrapped my mother's old silver hand mirror in a dark scarf, the only thing I had left of her. I knew exactly where I had to go. A few days earlier, a small, weather-beaten ship had docked at the far abandoned pier. Unremarkable, scarred by storms. It was my only hope. Moving like a shadow, I slipped past the sleeping guards and out through the gates. I ran through the quiet streets of the port, keeping close to the walls. My heartbeat thudded in my temples, merging with the crash of the waves. And then I saw it. The ship, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. The gangplanks were pulled up, but I spotted a rope hanging down from the side. Without thinking of fear, without thinking of what waited ahead, I grabbed it with sweaty palms. The rough hemp scraped my hands, my dress snagged on the fibers, stones scraped my knees, but I climbed. I climbed because I had no other choice. Hauling myself over the railing, I collapsed onto the hard deck, which smelled of tar and fish. No one shouted, no one raised an alarm. The ship was silent, empty. I crawled to a pile of folded sails and curled up in the darkest corner, hidden by barrels. Exhaustion, fear, and despair swallowed me whole. I shook so badly I could barely breathe. My eyes slid closed on their own. The last thing I felt before drifting into oblivion was the gentle sway of the deck beneath me and the distant voice of a watchman. That very night, the ship slipped its moorings and drifted silently out of the harbor, carrying me into the black, merciless expanse of open sea.
The first thing I felt in the morning was motion, a gentle rocking motion, almost soothing. I opened my eyes, and for a brief second, I thought I was still in my own bed, that a storm had simply rolled in outside my window. But above me, there was no carved canopy, only rough wooden beams in canvas, and the air didn't smell of perfume, but of salt water, tar, and something bitter, strange, unfamiliar. Memory crashed over me like an icy wave. The escape, the rope, the darkness. I lay still, listening to the creak of wood and the cries of gulls. I had made it. I was on a ship, far away from the vile old lord and my indifferent father. Carefully, I pushed myself up, bracing a hand against the cool barrels that had hidden me through the night. I needed to find the captain, to explain everything. Surely he would understand. Maybe he would even take me back to the island. No, never. Or perhaps he would leave me at the next port. I would accept anything, as long as it meant I would not return. I drew a deep breath to steady myself and peeked out from behind my hiding place, and my heart nearly stopped. Above me, at the very top of the main mast, snapped a flag in the morning wind, not the familiar emblem of a merchant vessel or the insignia of a royal fleet. It was a black banner, and on it, leering against the dark cloth, was a grinning skull, not with crossed sabers beneath it, but two boarding cutlasses, their blades painted a deep crimson, like dried blood. A pirate flag. The air rushed out of my lungs, my legs went weak beneath me, I clutched the barrel for support. This wasn't a merchant ship. This was a ship of outlaws, cutthroats, killers. The very villains I had read about in my novels, foolishly romanticizing them. And I, like a complete idiot, had climbed straight into their jaws.
I wasn't an escapee anymore. I was trapped, and the worst of my storybook nightmares had just become terrifyingly real.
My paralysis didn't last long. A harsh shout jolted me, forcing me to turn around. Well, look what we've got here. A rat. And not just any rat. A rat in a dress. A massive brute stood in front of me, his wind-burned face crisscrossed with scars. His small, sharp eyes scanned me from head to toe with blatant curiosity. I tried to step back, but the barrels were already pressing into my spine. Did I scream? I'm not sure. The next moment, my arms were yanked behind me and tied with a thick rope that bit into my skin. More rough hands seized my shoulders and dragged me across the deck. I stumbled, my legs barely supporting me. Laughter, whistles, crude jeers erupted all around. Faces blur, bearded, sun-darkened, hungry for spectacle. To them, I was a curiosity, a toy. Throw her to the sharks. No, let's have some fun first. A woman on board means bad luck. They dragged me to the stern and shoved me to my knees in front of a tall man in a dark coat, standing with his back to me. I knew immediately this was the captain. He toned slowly, and I forgot how to breathe. I expected another monster, old, scarred, eyes wild with madness, but the man who looked at me was striking. His features were sharp and defined, as though carved from stone. His skin sun-bronzed, his dark hair tied loosely at the nape, and his eyes, cool, piercing, the color of the sea in a storm. He was young, and in his calm, assessing gaze, there wasn't even a trace of the crude hunger burning in the eyes of his crew. "Captain!" someone yelled. "Look at the prize we found! Give her to us! Captain! We'll toss her overboard when we're done with her!" The roar of outrage and excitement grew louder. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the worst. But then his voice cut through the noise. "Quiet!" But so commanding that the entire deck fell, instantly silent. "Have you all gone mad? Look at her." His gaze moved over my face, over the torn but fine fabric of my dress. "He's no servant. She's a lady, and a noble one, unless I'm mistaken." He took a step toward me and leaned closer. His fingers brushed a strand of my red hair, light, almost weightless, yet the touch sent chills racing down my spine. "He's ladies, like this," he said, "aren't thrown overboard, gentlemen. They're ransomed, for a fortune." A murmur rippled through the crew, less cruel now, more intrigued. Then he turned fully to me, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of his eyes. "And until then, I'll take care of our treasure, personally." He didn't wait for arguments. In one swift motion, he cut the ropes around my wrists. His grip tightened around my arm, firm, painful, and he pulled me along, ignoring the protests behind us. He opened the door to the captain's cabin and practically pushed me inside. The door slammed shut, and I found myself alone with the most dangerous man I had ever met.
The door closed with a quiet final click. I stood alone in the spacious cabin. The air smelled of leather, old wood, and a faint trace of fine tobacco, so different from the harsh stench of the deck. For the first time in days, I was in an enclosed space without dozens of hungry eyes staring at me. For hours, I sat curled up in the corner, bracing myself for the worst. But nothing happened. The captain, whose name I would later learn was Julian Thorne, appeared only occasionally. He brought food and water, set them on the table, and left without a word. His silence was unsettling. Yet with each passing day, fear slowly loosened its grip. In its place came something strange, dizzying. Because he wasn't at all the monster I had imagined. He was intelligent, his speech refined, his manners almost aristocratic. He didn't leer at me,
didn't attempt to touch me. And slowly, piece by piece, the walls of my defenses began to weaken. In his face, I started to see the very hero I'd spent my childhood reading about. Mysterious, noble, a rogue with a hidden past. One evening, when he brought dinner, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Why?" I whispered before he could turn away. He paused, glancing back at me over his shoulder. "Why what?" "I mean, why haven't you touched me or given me to them?" A faint, tired smirk tugged at his lips, and for a moment his eyes glimmered with dry amusement. "I'm a captain, not a beast, and I've always preferred strategy over brute force." His answer, cold, calculated, didn't frighten me. It intrigued me. And then something inside me snapped. Days of silence, fear, isolation spilled out in a torrent of words. I told him everything. About my father, about Lord Hargrave, about my escape. I spoke as though trying to prove myself to him, to make him understand that I wasn't just a foolish girl, that I had reasons. He listened, quietly, intently, leaning against the doorframe. When I finished, there was something new in his gaze, not mere calculation, but interest. "So you're the governor's daughter," he said softly. "That is, interesting." And in that moment, looking at his face, illuminated by the warm light of the lamp, I let myself think the most dangerous thought of all. What if this wasn't a trap? What if this was fate? The very kind of extraordinary story I had always dreamed of, come to life. Because how could an ordinary pirate be like this? No, he wasn't ordinary. He was something else entirely. He was the one I had unknowingly waited for.
That night, the air in the cabin felt different, thick and warm, like the scent of a ripe tropical fruit on the verge of bursting open. He didn't come with dinner. He simply entered and stood by the door, watching me. And in his gaze, there was no cold calculation of a captain. There was fire, a fire that stole my breath. We didn't speak, not a word. He moved toward me slowly, and his fingers brushed my cheek. The touch was so gentle that a shiver ran down my spine. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Somewhere deep inside, I realized I had been waiting for this moment long before I understood it. His hands came to rest on my shoulders, warm and steady. The room seemed to close in around us, illuminated only by the silver light of the moon streaming through the porthole. In that glow, he looked impossibly striking, strong, confident, enigmatic. He drew me into an embrace, and when his lips met mine, it felt like lightning striking in the middle of the ocean, sudden, brilliant, overwhelming. That single moment shattered every barrier between us, including the ones inside me. All the fear, the loneliness, the sleepless nights, they melted away in the heat of that kiss. His arms wrapped around me, firm but careful, grounding me and lifting me at the same time. For the first time since leaving home, I felt safe. Terrified, but safe. He lifted my chin with a single touch and looked into my eyes. Really looked. Not as a captive, not as a bargaining chip, but as a woman. The world narrowed to his closeness, to the way he held me as though the chaos outside the cabin didn't exist. My heart hammered against my ribs so loudly I could hear it. He swept me up as though I weighed nothing at all and carried me to the berth. The warmth of him, the strength in his arms, it stole the breath from my lungs. He lay beside me, his presence filling the room, the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his skin, the quiet in his voice when he whispered my name, all of it felt impossibly real. I answered him with equal intensity, all fear dissolving into something deeper, something dangerously close to longing. For that one night, I was not a governor's daughter, and he was not a feared pirate. We were simply two souls who had found each other on the endless sea. And in the soft, blazing warmth he awakened in me, the last remnants of fear burned away. I believed, foolishly, blindly, that I had finally found the wild, intoxicating freedom I had always dreamed of. The days and nights that followed blended into one long, dizzying tapestry, woven from whispered touches, the taste of salt on our lips, and a slow-burning desire that seemed to thrum through the very air. The captain's cabin became our own world, a place apart from everything beyond its walls, the raging ocean, the crew, and the life I'd left behind. By day, he was a captain, commanding, composed, his voice carrying across the deck with authority. I found myself pausing whenever I heard it, my heart tightening in my chest. But when the cabin door closed behind him at night, the weight of the ship and the lives he commanded seemed to fall from his shoulders. He shed his coat, and in his eyes that same fierce fire returned, the one that had set my world ablaze that first night. Our connection was powerful, consuming. He touched me with a reverence that made me tremble, and I, in turn, learned to read his breath, the tension in his shoulders, the quiet urgency in his voice. I shed my shame as easily as I had once shed that peach-colored dress. In his arms, I was no naive girl. I was a woman, bold, unreserved, alive. We didn't speak of the future. We didn't mention the past. There was only the present, the quiet glow of mornings when he would ease the soreness from my muscles with sandalwood-scented oil, his touch gentle, almost protective, and the nights that left me breathless, dizzy, certain that nothing outside those walls mattered. I was intoxicated by him, by his strength, his command, his attention that felt like both a cure and a dangerous addiction. In his arms, I didn't feel like a captive. I felt seen, wanted, needed. But that feeling was a beautiful illusion, a sweet lie I clung to with the desperation of someone drowning. I held on to him as though he were a lifeline, convinced he embodied every impossible dream I had ever nurtured. I didn't notice the way his eyes grew more distant each morning. I didn't hear the whispers growing louder among the crew outside the cabin door. I was deaf and blind, overwhelmed by the pounding of my own heart and the wild rush of blood in my ears. I was lost in the storm of our passion, unaware that it was nothing more than the calm before the most devastating tempest of my life. The cracks in our comfortable world, scented with leather, salt, and heat, appeared subtly at first. A faint rumble from above, which I dismissed as thunder, but there was no storm. Only a heavy, unnatural silence on the deck. Then, one evening, he returned to the cabin with a sharp, abrupt movement, his face carved into a mask of cold concern. He tried to hide it. His smile was still dazzling, his touch still searing, but I felt it. Somewhere beyond that thin wooden wall, a storm was gathering. One night, I woke to harsh voices, not from above, but from the first mate's cabin, right next to ours. Through the thin wooden wall, I heard fragments of sentences, muffled and laced with anger. Miss the merchant ship, all because of her. The crew's getting restless. You're not the man you used to be, Captain. A woman on board brings bad luck. I froze, pressing myself against Julian's warm back. He slept soundly, his breathing steady. It's nothing, I whispered to myself, burying my face against his skin. They won't dare. But the storm broke the very next morning, the moment he stepped onto the deck. I pressed my face to the porthole, trying to stay hidden. Through the glass, I saw him standing before a semicircle of his men. But they weren't his men anymore. Their stances were defiant, their expressions hardened with resentment. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw Julian's back stiffen, saw the way his gaze swept over the crew. In his posture, usually so unshakable, I caught a flicker of strain. He said something, punctuating it with a sharp gesture toward the cabin. Rough laughter answered him, low and mocking, and someone threw his cap down onto the deck, a blatant sign of rebellion. He returned to the cabin pail, lips pressed into a thin line. He smelled not of the sea, but of anger, and something colder. Fear. Nothing, he muttered. Just a misunderstanding. But it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a warning, a deadline, and I learned the truth that very night.
That night, they dragged us onto the deck. 2 rough sailors burst into the cabin, their calloused hands clamping down on my arms before I had time to react. Julian stepped forward to defend me. Instantly, another pirate twisted his arms behind his back and pressed a blade to his throat. For the first time, I saw something in Julian's eyes that was worse than anger. Helplessness. A sinister hush filled the deck, broken only by the creak of rigging and the crash of waves. The entire crew had gathered, forming a tight, hostile circle. In the flickering torchlight, their faces looked like masks, hard, unforgiving. At the center stood the bosun, the one with the scar. "The time has come, Captain. The ship or the woman? Choose." My heart pounded so violently I thought it would tear free from my chest. I looked at Julian, silently pleading, believing, hoping that he would stand tall before them, fearless and unwavering, and say that the woman beside him was worth an entire fleet. But he didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on his men, on the people whose lives rested on his authority, now hanging by a thread. When he spoke, his voice sounded flat, unfamiliar, stripped of every trace of the passion that had burned in him just hours earlier. "She means nothing. Just, you know how it is. Women on a ship." His words struck me like a physical blow. This wasn't strategy. This wasn't a clever ploy. This was the truth he chose. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Words are wind, Captain! Prove it!" Julian turned his head slowly. Finally, his gaze met mine. But there was no love there, no regret, only the cold resolve of a man protecting his own skin. He looked at me the way one looks at an obstacle, a problem to be removed. In that moment, my world didn't shatter with a crash. It broke with a quiet, devastating crack, the sound of my heart splintering, along with every illusion I had ever held about him. The noble pirate, the destined love, the fated story I believed we shared. I stared at the man I thought I knew and saw instead a coward willing to sacrifice anything and anyone for power. The sailors seized me again, but I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I simply looked into his eyes, memorizing every line of betrayal. He looked away first, and silent tears slid down my cheeks. They threw me into a cramped storage space beneath the deck, a former locker for ropes and gear. The air was stale and thick, smelling of tar and fear. I sat on the bare planks, my fingers digging into the wood. I couldn't cry. Not a single tear would come. Inside me there was only a vast, numbing emptiness. He had betrayed me. He, whose touch I had believed to be the only real thing in my life, had cast me aside, like something worthless. I could hear voices above, rough laughter, loud arguments as they divided the few possessions I had. They even fought over who would keep my little silver mirror. To them, I was already gone. The door creaked open. Framed in the dim lantern light, he stood there. I didn't move. I didn't lift my eyes. Let him do whatever he had come to do. He crouched down in front of me. He smelled of rum, but his gaze was sober and empty. When he spoke, his voice was lifeless. "In the morning, they mean to execute you." "As ordered by my captain?"
I whispered, the words tasting like bitter ash. He stared past me, silent for a long moment. I can't let that happen, Gloria, but I can't keep you here either. The crew won't stop. There is another way. He took my hand and led me through dark, deserted corridors. I followed without thinking, like a sleepwalker. At the stern, away from watchful eyes, a small boat hung from its ropes. He helped me climb into it, his hands quick, efficient, as though performing a grim, necessary task. He pointed toward the black, motionless expanse of ocean. This is your way out. The sea has more mercy than my crew, and more than I do. Then he turned to me, and there was no flame left in his eyes, none of the warmth that had once set me alight. He pulled me into a final embrace. My body, frozen with fear, ached for comfort, for the safety I'd once thought I'd found in him, but he pushed me away, sharp and cold. Forget everything between us, Gloria. Whatever you thought you felt, love, it was only passion, a game. Do you understand? Those words cut deeper than any blade. They erased the last fragile memory I had clung to. He handed me his dagger, the one he always wore at his belt. Its handle, smooth from his touch, gleamed faintly in the lantern light. Take it, for protection. I took it. The metal was icy, like his heart. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't love. It was a final cruelty, a parting gift from an executioner to his victim. He shoved the boat, and it slid from the davits with a groan, dropping into the black water below. I sat there, gripping the dagger with numb fingers, watching as the dark silhouette of the sea beast slowly dissolved into the night. He didn't look back, not once. Around me, the merciless sea closed in, and silence. A silence so deep it roared in my ears. My heart was shattered. Ahead lay nothing, only darkness, cold, and an endless, indifferent void.
The sun became my executioner. Its rays scorched my skin, blinded my eyes, turning each day into an endless trial. At night, the cold seeped into my bones, and I lay at the bottom of the small boat, listening to the whisper of the waves, a whisper that felt like mockery. I clutched the hilt of the dagger, Julian's last gift, the only solid thing left in this churning world of water. I hadn't eaten, I barely sipped what little water remained. Death no longer frightened me. It was something I waited for, an end to the heat, to the thirst, to the pain burning inside me brighter than the tropical sun. On the dawn of the third day, I saw land. At first, I thought it was a mirage, a trick of my delirious mind. But the shapes didn't fade. They sharpened. Yellow sand, a fringe of palm trees. The waves lifted my boat and carried it toward the shore, gently depositing it onto the sand. I crawled out and collapsed to my knees. The sand was cool, damp. I pressed my lips to it, sobbing without tears. My body was too drained even for that. "Hey there, redhead! Forgot how to stand on solid ground?" The voice was raspy, rough with smoke. I flinched, and without seeing the figure clearly in the blinding sun, I instinctively lunged toward the boat. My hand found the dagger's hilt. When a shadow leaned toward me, I swung the blade with all the strength I had left. "Don't come any closer!" The man stopped a few feet away. He was elderly, thin, his skin like dry parchment cracked by years of sun and salt. He didn't even flinch. His blue eyes, clear and sharp, studied the trembling blade in my hand, then my terrified face. And then he laughed, not a cruel laugh, an exhausted, warm chuckle. "Oh, easy there, wildcat. You're safe, I promise. Don't be afraid of me, girl. I care about your charms about as much as I care about the moon's tides. No strength left for foolishness and even less desire. I'm old, and wise enough not to approach a woman holding a knife. Put that steel out of your mind. I'm Joe, and this," he gestured around us, "is my island." Though his gaze drifted again to the dagger, sharp and assessing. "Though, judging by the way you hold that thing, you've got quite a story. You'll tell it later, after you drink some water, eat something, and come back to life. Come on, you look like you've walked through every circle of hell at once." And leaning on this old stranger's arm, I took the first steps of my new life. I was saved. But I had no idea that meeting Joe was not just salvation. It was the beginning of a new, thrilling chapter in my story.
The days on the island fell into a simple rhythm: find water, gather fruit, keep a fire going. Joe proved to be a stern but patient teacher. He showed me which roots were edible, how to weave nets from vines, and never came any closer than the work required. His steady, almost fatherly care soothed the raw places inside me. For the first time in a long while, I felt safe. One evening, we sat by the fire, and I found myself staring at the dagger that laid between us on a flat stone. Moonlight picked out the edge of the blade. "He gave it to me before he pushed me out to sea," I said softly, unable to hold it in any longer. "He told me to forget, that whatever I thought was love was only passion." And then the story poured out of me. Everything, unvarnished. About my father, the governor, about the lecherous lord, about my flight onto a pirate ship, about Julian Thorne, about the hunger I mistook for love and the searing shame of betrayal. Joe listened without interrupting. In the firelight, his face looked carved from stone. When he finished, he was silent for a long time, watching the flames. Finally, he spoke, and there was no scolding in his voice, only a tired bitterness. "You foolish girl. You trusted a pirate, like trusting a shark to be a vegetarian." He gave a short, harsh laugh. "All right, since we share shelter and food, I'll share my story. I used to be a captain myself, not a flashy type like your Julian. No, I ran my ship with a steady hand, until my crew decided I'd gotten old and soft. They wanted a new captain, young, strong, unscrupulous. The man they picked was the one I called a friend. They marooned me here on this strip of land, left me with a water skin and a pistol with one shot, as a keepsake." Joe fell silent again, and then his gaze dropped to the dagger. "He recognized him the day you came ashore. That crest on the hilt, I saw it on the belt of the upstart who took my place. Your Julian." The world seemed to freeze. The vastness I'd known shrank to a single, unbearable point. I couldn't find a word. "Yes, girl, we don't just share an island, we share an enemy." He held out his hand. I picked up the dagger from the stone and placed it in his palm. He closed his fingers around the hilt, my hand fitting in the same notches his had. Then he spoke low, and the words seared into me. "I promise you this. We will settle accounts with that pretty face. For everything. He will suffer as you suffered. He will regret every choice he's made as I regret mine." Life on the island stopped being mere survival. Under Joe's guidance, it became a harsh but honest schooling. He taught me how to make fire, not just for comfort, but with a single spark and a small bundle of dry grass when your life depends on it. He showed me how to throw a sharpened stick so it would actually strike a fish in shallow water. But his lessons weren't only about keeping the body alive, they were about keeping the spirit intact. While we mended a homemade net, he would say, "Trust your ears and your eyes, not your heart. The heart's a fool. It believes what it wants to believe. Eyes spot the trick, ears hear the lie." He taught me pirate craft, how to trim a sail to lose a pursuer, not merely to go faster, how to read the stars not only for course, but for where the prize might be or where safety hides, how to fight, not with a gentleman's rules, but dirty, brutal, and decisive. He'd grin watching me practice a thrust to the throat with the dagger on an imaginary enemy. "They think strength lives in the muscle," he said, tapping his forearm. "But strength lives here." He tapped his temple. "And here," he tapped my chest. "Your fury, that's our fuel. My experience, that's our trump card. Together, we're a storm built by one man, and he will bitterly regret it. I promise you that." I felt the change catch like flame. My hands grew calloused. My eyes took on the same hard steel he had. I was no longer the fragile governor's daughter. I became his instrument, his deadliest project. Then one morning, after nearly a year, he said simply, "It's time." "Time for what?" I asked, though my heart was already pounding, sensing the answer. "To start our storm, girl. We've waited long enough." We packed our meager belongings and, over the course of a few days, crossed to the far side of the island, hidden from the sea. There, Joe built a huge fire on a high cliff, stacking damp branches that billowed thick black smoke, the universal distress signal. A few days later, a sail appeared on the horizon. At first, it was only a tiny speck, but my heart leaped at the promise of change. Without a word, Joe tossed another handful of damp seaweed onto our signal fire, and the column of smoke grew darker and thicker, climbing into the sky like a banner of our desperation and hope. The ship altered course and drew nearer. Faces peered down from its deck, curious, frightened, not hardened like the pirates' faces I remembered. Joe and I must have looked like two castaways, sun-browned to the bone, wearing makeshift garments of skins and salt-bleached rags, a fierce determination in our eyes that betrayed our ragged appearance. When they lowered a boat, Joe grabbed my elbow with the same steady, sure grip he always used and whispered, "Remember who you are. You are not a victim. You are the storm that's yet to break. Act like it." We climbed aboard. The merchant captain, a pudgy, red-faced man, regarded us with plain confusion and distaste. "Who in God's name are you people?" he demanded. I opened my mouth to recite the rehearsed tale of wrecked merchants, but Joe beat me to it. He straightened out to his full, considerable height, and something in his bearing, an unarguable authority, made the captain take a step back. Joe's voice rumbled, still sounding like the man who once commanded 100 cutthroats. "We're the ones the sea spared. We ask only this: take us to England. What happens after that is none of your concern." To my surprise, the captain nodded and ordered a cabin for us. Joe's presence had outweighed our ragged looks. I stood at the rail as the island, both cursed and beloved, shrunk into a brown strip and then faded into haze. A lump rose in my throat. I thought of how close I had come to dying of thirst on that shore, of how I had trembled in fear the very first night. I also remembered quiet evenings by the fire, Joe's lessons, the feeling of strength gathering inside me. That little piece of land had been both prison and cradle for what I had become, and through the bittersweet farewell, a new, fierce feeling burned up in me, hot as rum. Anticipation. The voyage to England was not homecoming. It was a march to war. And watching the disappearing horizon, I made a vow to myself: the next time I see a sail on the water, it will fly under my command. England greeted us with damp gray skies and the choking bustle of port streets. After the wide freedom of the ocean and the hush of the island, everything here felt cramped, loud, and foreign. But Joe knew where to go. He led me to a solid, unremarkable stone house on the edge of Liverpool. Inside, it smelled of dust and closed air, but it was shelter, true shelter, with thick walls and a door that locked. Joe wasted no time weaving our story. To the neighbors and the few business contacts he kept, I was his daughter, Emily, miraculously found after a shipwreck that took my mother. The tale held up. My sunburned, smile-worn face fit it well enough. One evening, weeks later, while we sat by the fire,
Joe set down his pipe and grunted. "I'm tired of this pretending," he said, staring into the flames. "Playing the quiet, respectable man takes patience, and I don't have much left. We didn't come here to settle into a tame life ashore. The sea calls. Do you hear it, girl?" I watched him, holding my breath. I knew this day would come. His voice hardened, the same steel I'd heard on the island. "I have a plan, and, most important, I have the means to put it into motion." He rose and walked to the worn rug in the center of the room. With a heavy pry bar, he lifted a floorboard with a dry snap, then another, revealing a hollow beneath the floor. "Come here, girl." I leaned over and peered into the cavity. There, in a stone-lined compartment, sat a small but hefty chest, blackened with age. Joe fitted an ancient key and turned it with a decisive click. He threw back the lid, and the gasp that escaped me was almost a soundless thing. The chest was full. Gold coins of every mint and hue glittered together like a flowing river. Pouches of pearls lay piled like river pebbles. Sparkling emeralds and blood-red rubies were scattered among them as if they were mere beads. Blinding wealth. Enough to buy a fleet. Joe's eyes narrowed as he watched the firelight catch the metal. "This isn't just treasure," he said softly. "It's our revenge. I've been saving this for years, knowing one day I'd meet it. Now, it's for us. What do you think, girl? Are you ready?" He lifted a heavy gold doubloon from the top and put it into my hand. The coin was cold and unbelievably heavy. In his voice, there was a metallic ring of battle plans. "This will buy our ship, the right ship, the best we can find in this town. These coins will pay our crew, buy our weapons. We don't just go back to sea, Gloria. We go back as a storm, and we'll find him. You know who I mean." I closed my fingers around the doubloon and felt its weight answer in my chest. It was more than metal. It was the condensed essence of all our grief, our fury, and our oath. Our ticket to war. The months that followed passed in a rush of feverish activity. The treasure from beneath the floor bought us the fastest, meanest ship Liverpool's docks could offer. It wasn't the largest vessel, but it was honed like a blade, sleek lines and fresh, dark paint along her hull. Joe christened her the Avenger. The name said everything. But a ship is only wood and rope. Its heart is the crew. And here Joe showed himself a strategist. He didn't hunt for polished adventurers or noble buccaneers. He hunted outcasts, men with dark pasts and empty futures, whose loyalty could be bought not just with gold, but with a new purpose. He prowled the dirtiest port taverns, his old piercing gaze searching for men whose eyes held not only greed, but an unquenched rage. Each time he struck a bargain, he laid down a single, non-negotiable condition. His voice was made of steel and hate when he said it. "You'll answer to more than me. On this ship, you'll answer to my daughter. Her word is my word. Her order is law. If you can't serve her, you can rot here with your rum." Some cursed and turned away, grumbling about a woman's whims. The ones who stayed were different. They looked at me, the tall, quiet girl with sea-cold eyes, and didn't see a pampered lady. They saw a shadow of their captain. They felt the steel in me, forged on the anvil of betrayal and survival. My training changed too. We stopped practicing on the sand. We trained on the deck of the Avenger. Joe taught me not only how to fence, but how to command with a blade in my hand. He made me learn every rope, every sail, every inch of the ship until I could feel her as an extension of my own body. Watching me issue orders to a handful of grim sailors, he would say, "They must see a leader even when fear racks you. Fear they'll forgive, weakness never." And I watched those bearded, scarred men begin to look at me differently.
first from fear of Joe, then from curiosity, and finally because they saw I wasn't playing at command, I was becoming one. To them, I was a mystery. To Joe, I was his greatest project and his only family. On the day the crew was filled and the stores were loaded, Joe laid his old, weathered hand on my shoulder and announced solemnly, "They're ready to take orders from you. Are you ready to lead them?" I looked at the dark hull of the ship, ready to put to sea, at the crew who had stopped working to wait for my word. Clouds were rolling up on the horizon, the kind that promise a storm. "Yes," I answered. My voice didn't crack once. "I'm ready."
One foggy morning, the Avenger slipped from the quay without fanfare. No cheers, no farewell crowds, only the creak of rigging and the flap of a dark sail filling with wind. Joe's crew moved with a quiet, grim precision. They weren't the rogues from storybooks. They were focused, professional men with cold eyes. Their first target came to them by mistake, a fast pirate sloop that fancied it would plunder an apparently lone vessel. As the distance closed and a familiar shout rose from the sloop, "Lower your sails!" a dead silence fell across the Avenger. Joe stood on the rail and slowly turned toward them. His voice, projected through a brass megaphone, cut across the water like ice. "You've picked the wrong ship." On his command, our guns, already trained, belched iron. Not to take, but to kill. The first broadside snapped the sloop's mast like a twig. What followed wasn't a chaotic boarding brawl, but a methodical, clinical ruin. Our men worked with terrifying efficiency, like craftsmen at a grim trade. I stood beside Joe, my hand tight on the hilt of my sword, and watched. I watched the insolent spark die in the pirates' eyes as excitement turned to horror when they realized they'd met not prey, but a predator far worse. We took everything from that sloop, gold, provisions, charts, and left the wreck and those who remained to the mercy of the sea. That was how our campaign began. We became a ghost, a nightmare stalking the pirate brotherhood of the Caribbean. We didn't plunder for sport, we punished. We didn't parley, we eradicated. Rumors of a black phantom ship hunting its own spread from port to port. But no one aboard the Avenger, save Joe and me, knew the deeper truth. The gold and booty were a pleasant bonus. For Joe and for me, it was the hunt. Every sunken pirate ship, every seized chart, every coerced clue, each was a step toward one single goal. We were hunting her, the sea beast, and the captain whose name I once whispered with love and now spat with ice-cold hatred. Every morning I scanned the horizon for a familiar silhouette. Every night I listened to the waves, sure they'd one day bring news. The sea had become our hunting ground, and we wouldn't rest until we found our prey.
Years had passed. Not just years. An era carved into my memory by storms, gunpowder, and blood. The Avenger had become both legend and nightmare on the sea lanes, and I had become its shadow, its living emblem. But the most important battle was not on the waves. It was inside the captain's cabin, where old Joe was wasting away day by day. He lay in his bunk, and it seemed the life was leaving his dried body inch by inch. Not his spirit, though. His eyes, still sharp as ever, were fixed on me, my girl. His voice was soft, like the rustle of canvas. He squeezed my hand with that old, still grippy paw. "Promise me, swear it to an old pirate, you'll find him. You'll look that bastard in the face and remind him of us. Of me, the old man he betrayed, of the girl whose heart he crushed." Father, the word ran through my head. You became a father to me, a real one. Tears traced down my cheeks, but my voice was steady and clear as a blade. "I swear it, Joe. I will find him. He will pay. For us both."
He nodded, and a faint shadow of a smile flickered on his lips. Then his hand relaxed and his gaze drifted outward, toward the open sea that had always been his home. When they prepared his body for the last passage, wrapped in sailcloth with a cannonball at his feet, I stood on the rail, and something inside me screamed with grief. I was burying more than a mentor. I was burying the man who had pulled me back from the edge of death, who'd taught me to do more than survive, to be strong, who had looked at me with a pride my birth father never offered. He had given me not only purpose, but family. And now he was gone. To the deep we send the body, but his spirit will sail forever in the Avenger's canvas, the boatswain hauled, and the plank under Joe's bier tilted. We laid him to the sea, as a captain deserves. The crew, rough, seasoned men, stood bareheaded. What showed in their eyes was not just sorrow, but barely contained rage, a fury that can only be sated by vengeance. As his wrapped body slid into the dark water, I lifted my head and looked at my people. No one spoke, no one hesitated. Joe's place had become mine, Captain Gloria. They revered me, not for a beauty long hidden beneath sunburn, salt, and a hard set to my jaw, but for the courage I had proved in the heat of boarding fights, for the seamanship that had guided the ship through storms taller than masts, for the ferocity with which I fought alongside them. My wild red hair became the standard they followed into the thick of battle. They obeyed me without question, because I was flesh of their old captain and the living spirit of their shared vengeance. I was their captain, their captainess, and we all knew the hunt was drawing to its end. The days went on, and though Joe was gone, I lived. And the woman within me lived too, with her longing, her ache for human warmth, her exhaustion from constant readiness. The fire Julian once lit in me still had no place to burn. Alaric noticed that woman, my first mate, young, fearless, a Norwegian with flaxen hair and eyes the color of the northern sea. He didn't fall in love with the fierce captain the crew followed. He fell for the other one, the woman who sometimes stood still at sunset, the one whose fingers trembled after too many nights on edge. He entered my cabin without knocking, a privilege I had granted him. He smelled of wind, salt, and gunpowder. Mischief danced in his blue eyes, but tonight it met my icy stare. I moved around him slowly, appraising him like an adversary or prey. "You were reckless at the port side today, Alaric," I said, voice flat, not accusing. "You nearly put yourself in the line of fire." He gave a sheepish half-smile. "But I knew you'd have my back." I stopped in front of him, close enough to feel his warmth. "Don't count on my protection as if it's the mercy of the waves. I am not a storm. I am your captain." Before he could reply, I took hold of his collar and pulled him toward me. Our lips met, not gently, not tenderly. It was a collision, a claim. I made sure he understood who set the terms. His arms instinctively caught me, but I broke away just enough to hold his gaze. "Take this off." I nodded at his shirt. He obeyed without hesitation, instinctively so, ready for whatever game he thought this was. But it wasn't a game. I watched the fire in his eyes flare, a mix of challenge and surrender. When he reached for me again, I caught his wrist at my waist. "Slower," I breathed against his lips, guiding his hand where I chose. Tonight I decide the rhythm. In that cabin, there was no room for softness, only fierce, consuming passion, the kind that roared like a storm. I let myself drift in it just long enough to drown out the relentless roar of hatred that lived inside me. I took what I needed, his strength, his devotion, his desire, giving him just enough to keep the flame alive. I led the dance the way I led an attack, with strategy, with precision, without mercy. He tried to take control more than once, but a sharp look from me, or the quick grip of my hand, set him back in his place. He was my first mate, the strongest fighter on the ship, but in that room, he was simply mine to command. When the moment passed and the world returned, he reached for me, wanting warmth, closeness. I straightened, still above him, still in control, letting the last waves of intensity fade. His hand brushed my cheek. I pushed it away. "Review tomorrow's positions by morning," I said, my voice cold, sharp. "And change the watch. You're dismissed." "I love you," he said quietly, the fire in his eyes raw and real, the kind of fire that once might have burned me too. "Love is a luxury I cannot afford," I answered, turning to the map on my table. "All I have is duty." He didn't understand that his love was, to me, nothing more than a temporary harbor, a shelter for the body while the soul remained locked in ice. My heart hadn't merely been broken once, it had been frozen solid. And in that frozen core, where naive dreams once bloomed, now lived one single devouring presence. Its name was vengeance, and it tolerated no rivals. This was the day I had waited for, the day I'd seen in nightmares and in the most private corners of my hope. A familiar silhouette crept into the fog on the horizon, and my heart stopped, then began to beat with a fury that felt like it would tear my ribs apart. I knew her at once. The sea beast, the ghost ship from my past, the ship that had carried away the pieces of my heart. Above her, the same flag snapped in the wind. "Up all sail!" My voice came out raw, but it carried. "No ship gets away! Course! Intercept!" The Avenger lunged forward like a hound that had scented blood. The chase stretched on, cruel and patient. Hours turned to an eternity. Every trim of a sail, every slap of water at the bow drew me closer to him, closer to the face I had once seen in tenderness and then in cold betrayal. I remembered his laugh, his stories of the sea, the night he had looked at me as if I were his entire world. Then the ice in his eyes, the words, "It was only passion," the black water taking me. Now we were even. The first broadside erupted and hell spilled across the decks. Cannons roared, wounded men howled, rage pierced the smoke. I fought at the heart of it. My blade found target after target, but my eyes hunted only one face. I cut and parried, each opponent a blur, until in every man I saw his features. Then I saw Alaric. He fought like a man possessed, hair whipping, eyes alight with the same desperate fire that had once touched something frozen inside me. He held 3 off, covering the approach to the rail where I stood. And there, through smoke and chaos, I saw him. Tall, in his familiar coat, eyes the color of storm-tossed water. Julian. Our gazes met. In his, I found no surprise, no fear, only a cold, indifferent recognition. A shot rang out from the sea beast's rigging like thunder. I saw Alaric flinch. His sword slipped from his weakening hand. He turned toward me slowly, as if in a bad dream, a red line appearing at his mouth. I threw myself to him, catching his falling weight. He was heavy and helpless. "Gloria," he breathed. "Hold on," I rasped, pressing him to me, clamping a hand on the wound that bled hot and fast. "Hold on, damn you!" He smiled that mad smile once more, but the fire in his eyes faded to fog. His hand trembled, reached for my face, and fell limp. "You, my storm," he whispered. He died in my arms. He died with my name on his lips. Silence crashed over me amid the roar of battle. I raised my head slowly. Smoke, screams, death, all receded into a blurred backdrop. There was only one figure left in the world, Julian, standing on his ship, watching the carnage unfold. Something ancient and pitiless awoke in me then. I laid Alaric gently on the deck and stood. The light in my eyes was gone. Only ice and steel remained. "Take them!" I roared, and my voice cut through the din of battle. At the sight of my face and the fallen Alaric at my feet, my crew surged with doubled fury. It ceased to be a fight and became a slaughter. We swept everything before us. Resistance broke. The last begging survivors were left hanging from the yards without ceremony. We hauled the prize aboard. The boatswain came to me then, grim-faced, a blood-stained bandage on his arm. "Captain, he's below, in the hold, waiting." I nodded, words refusing me. I went down into the hold, step by step. The air smelled of damp, iron, and fear. Behind a grate, in the dark corner, the man who started my war and who must end it sat. Julian Thorne. I stopped before the bars, looking at his once handsome, now hollowed face. There was fatigue in his eyes, but not repentance. After all these years, we were face to face again, like in that cabin where our passion began, like on a deck where it had ended in betrayal. Only now, the bars kept him in, and this time, he was the prisoner.
Silence after battle was always the loudest. It swelled with the groans of the wounded, the creak of patched timbers, the ragged breath of survivors. But today, that chorus held one more sound, Alaric's crushing silence. We buried him at sunset. His body, sewn into the cleanest sailcloth he had loved so dearly, slipped into the water with a soft whisper. I shed no tears. I stood tall, my face carved from stone, watching the waves take the last spark of warmth that had flickered in my frozen world. The crew watched me, waiting. For what? Words? Grief? A crack in my armor? But I was empty. Inside me was only a black, bottomless void where all feeling had fallen. A week passed. 7 long days during which the Avenger healed her wounds while I did not. I spent hours on the quarterdeck, staring at the horizon that no longer held mystery or promise. It was just empty. And in the hold, in a damp, dark cell, waited the man who had driven my life like a blade through flesh. Julian Thorne, my ghost, my obsession, the reason I had breathed for years. I did not go to him. I did not order his death. I waited. I waited for the fury, dulled by the shock of Alaric's death, to sharpen again into something honed and lethal. I waited until I could look at Julian without feeling my knees weaken. The crew did not understand. I saw it in their glances, in their quiet questions they didn't dare voice aloud. They were used to my decisiveness, to my ruthless efficiency. But now their captain, their storm, stood still, allowing the prisoner, the man responsible for their first mate's death, to breathe their air, drink their water. On the 4th day, the boatswain approached me. His question was firm, controlled. "Captain, why do you delay? Finish him. The men grumble. They want justice. They want him hanging from the yardarm." I turned my head slowly. My gaze was so cold, so empty, that he stepped back without meaning to. "His death is not their justice," I said, my voice flat and lifeless. "It is mine, and I alone decide when it happens. My order is wait." He retreated without another word, but the tension aboard grew, thick and electric, like a storm waiting to break. They had seen Alaric's body. They had seen my fury during the battle, and they could not understand why I now held back. But all I could do was stand and wait, until the ghosts of my past spoke their last words. until I gathered the strength to take that final step, to look into the eyes of the man who had shattered my life, and to decide what I would say to him before I ended it. The night was as black as the one long ago when he cast me out to sea. The ship smelled of unanswered questions. The crew slept, exhausted from battle and from the strange inaction of their captain. I unlocked the hold without a sound. My lamp slid shadows across the planks. He sat propped against a barrel and looked up when he heard my steps. There was no fear in his eyes, only a tired expectation. I set the lamp down so its light fell full on my face. "Do you recognize me, Julian?" I asked, my voice even and low. He stared, and I watched bewilderment flare into a slow, ice-cold recognition. "Gloria? But you... Was I supposed to die?" I finished for him. "You turned me out to sea, remember? You said it was only passion." He sprang up and gripped the bars of his cage. "Gloria, I thought of you every day. I hoped you'd survived. There were rumors, an island nearby where an old man lived. I thought the tide would bring you there." I laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "You thought. You gambled my life like dice. You lost. I survived. Joe found me. He became my father. He's dead now. And you are in my cage." He begged, stumbling through excuses. Youth, pressure of the crew, that he'd always loved me. His words were poison, familiar and sweet. They stirred not only the hurt of betrayal, but the heat of those nights aboard his ship. Hate and desire knotted inside me until I could hardly breathe. I unlocked the door. The click of the key sounded louder than a cannon. I stepped into the hold. Prove it. Prove it wasn't only passion. And in the darkness, among the damp planks and the smell of fish, we became what we once were. Captain and captive. Two people whose fire had always been perilously close to destruction. It wasn't love. It was a battle. His first touch felt like a shock, forbidden and raw. I didn't pull away. I met him with the same force, pressing my mouth to his, not for tenderness, but for contest. Salt, the sting of tears, the metallic tang of blood, whose I could not say. We crashed to the floor, the boards bit into our backs. His hands tore at the fabric of my dress, but there was no former tenderness, only a desperate, almost animal rage. His lips burned along my neck, my shoulder, my chest. Each kiss was both a caress and an agony of repentance. He whispered my name, pleas and curses threaded together. I answered with the same destructive hunger. My nails scored his back, leaving red marks he would carry as memory. Our mouths gave forgiveness we could not grant, and vengeance we could not complete. And every motion was a memory. The cabin where he had been my god, the deck where he became my executioner. Two storms collided in open water. There was no past, no future, only a consuming, devastating present. We burned each other to ash. When it ended, so quiet and so thunderous, we lay in the blackness, ragged breaths the only proof of life. Our bodies entangled in sweat, rage, and old pain. There was no intimacy left, only the abyss we had reopened and looked into together. We emptied each other out, only ash remained. I was the first to rise. I dressed with the same cold efficiency I used to ready the ship for battle. "Stand," I told him. "Follow me." He obeyed, stunned. I led him across the sleeping vessel to the boat hanging at the davits. No one watched. "Get in," I ordered as I lowered the small boat. He looked at me, bewildered. "What are you doing, Gloria?" he asked. I drew the dagger from my belt, the very one he had given me, and held it out. "You gave this to me when you sent me to die. I return it." I pressed the hilt into his hand.
You said you thought of me all these years. Now, you will have eternity to think about how you gave me freedom that made me stronger than you, how you handed me the vengeance I never finished. I did not kill you, Julian. I did worse. I gave you life. Life with this. I shoved the boat from the side. The current took it at once, carrying him into the open dark. He sat there, dagger in hand, and looked at me, at the ghost of his past who had become the captain of his nightmare.
I stood at the rail, watching the dark dot of the skiff dissolve into the pre-dawn haze. The air was cold and damp, but inside me a frozen fire burned. A sudden rustle made me turn. A cabin boy, no more than 13, popped out from the shadow of the wheelhouse, face as white as a gull's wing. His eyes were fixed, first on the empty davits where the boat had been, then on me. His voice trembled. "Captain, I saw everything. Why? Why did you let him go? He's our enemy. It killed Mr. Alaric." I turned slowly to face him. A faint, lifeless smile played across my lips. It made the boy flinch. "He did the same to me once," I said, softly, staring past his head into the fog where Julian had vanished. "Set me in a boat and sent me away. Gave me my freedom." I paused, letting the meaning sink in. "But there's one small difference." My voice dropped to a whisper, sharp as a blade. "Where he put me ashore, there was an island. Trading ships called there. I was rescued." I stepped to the rail and pointed toward the endless empty ocean, glimmering with the first pale light of morning. "Here, there is nothing but sea. Deep, cold, and merciless. And they say there are hungry sharks in these waters." The boy's eyes widened in horror and understanding. He staggered back, clutching at his throat. I no longer looked at him. I turned my back on the sea and on the revenge I had finally completed. I had not given Julian a quick death. I had given him something worse, a long, slow sentence. I had given him hope that would rot into despair, and despair that would become food for the deep.
Dawn found the Avenger on the open sea. The air was clean and sharp after the night's storm of passions. The crew gathered on deck, testing me with their eyes. In those looks, the unasked question hung plainly. What now? I stepped up onto the rail, feeling dozens of gazes on me. The wind whipped my hair, and I drew in the salt air like a benediction of freedom. Questions? My voice rang out, clear and without a hint of doubt. The bosun, an old grumbler who'd been through fire and flood with Joe and me, stepped forward. "Captain, the enemy is beaten. What course?" I scanned my people, those desperate, loyal dogs of war Joe and I had forged into a single fearsome fist. Course? Back to Santa Ana. There's one man there, the governor. I want to look him in the face. For a heartbeat, silence held. Then a low, approving rumble moved across the deck. They understood. They knew my story. And after that, I raised my voice and the murmur fell, we set course for England. Surprised exclamations shifted into assent. England was alien to them, dry land and unlikely plunder, but I had plans. Do not worry, gentlemen. A cold, joyless smile touched my lips. There's business to be done there, not of the sea, but of the land. We'll pay a visit to an old and very, very wealthy lord. I let the word settle. Many years ago, he promised to shower me with gold and diamonds. I think it's time to remind him of that promise. In person. That was enough. The hunger for vengeance, which had worn the face of justice, now took on the simpler, more practical hunger for gain. For them it was coin, for me it was something harder to name, the last stubborn root of my past that needed pulling free. Lord Hargrave, the man who had first shoved me toward the abyss. The Avenger turned smoothly, caught by a following breeze. Behind us lay the sea that had swallowed my traitorous lover, my adopted father, and the last traces of the naive girl who once read pirate tales. Ahead lay a new horizon. I walked into it with a cold heart and iron will. Captain Gloria, not the governor's daughter, not a captive, not a lover, but the master of her fate. A storm to anyone who had dared to wrong her.